Hey, thank you everybody for joining us today for another installment of Better Know a Birder. A couple of administrative things first. Everyone who is listening in on Zoom, you're all on mute. If you have a question for Maureen, you can use the chat box. And if you are tuning in through Facebook Live, you can post your questions in the comment box, and those will be relayed to me to relay to Maureen. So anytime you have a question, just type it in there. I'll ask a few questions, then we'll take questions from the audience. And I am Dan Scheinman. I'm the Bird Conservation Director for Audubon, Arkansas. And it's my pleasure to be talking with my friend, Dr. Maureen McClung, who teaches ecology, animal behavior, and conservation biology at Hendrix College. During her master's work on Amazonian tamarins, she had her sights set on a research career in primatology, but then a trip to Africa opened her eyes to the wonder of birds. She completed a PhD in Dr. Kim Smith's lab at the University of Arkansas, where she studied the impacts of forest disturbance on breeding birds in the Ozarks. Now she's at Hendrix, where she conducts research with undergraduates to understand how birds and other wildlife respond to noise pollution. She believes that field experiences are powerful in helping the next generation appreciate and respect birds and nature, and so she tries to get her students into the field as much as possible. So Maureen, I find it really interesting that you were working in the Amazon, which has its own amazing bird life, but it wasn't until you went to Africa that you got turned on to birds. So was there a particular species that sparked your interest, or was it just the rich diversity of bird life that's so out in the open and easy to see? What happened?
Well, I guess I should start off by saying Africa came before I started my field work in Peru. So that was part of it. And so I started my master's that I worked on at UNC Chapel Hill. I was in an animal behavior lab, and it was a bioacoustics lab. So everybody was studying issues in animal communication. And we had people working on frogs. We had people working on giant river otters. But most of the people were working on birds. And I felt a little, kind of out of sync, because I had actually, these words literally came out of my mouth when I was doing an internship at the Smithsonian in DC when I was in college. I remember telling an ornithologist that I thought birds were boring and that mammals were where it was at. I reflect on that conversation all the time, and that ornithologist must have thought I was, well, maybe a little naive. But that was my attitude going into this lab, where I was like, well, I'm the only one, studying primates, and these birds, they're interesting, but not that as interesting as mammals. But because I was in that lab, I began to be exposed to the life of birding. I helped out with labs. This is a Haven Wiley lab at UNC. And that Christmas, after I started grad school, that Christmas break, I went to Africa on a trip with, it was actually through a colleague of mine now at Hendrix, Matt Moran. He was my professor here, and he organized this trip for alumni to go to Africa on a safari. And we hired a local guide whose name was David. He was fantastic. And there was a core group of us that would get up really early in the morning and go out in the Jeep and look for birds while everyone else was sleeping in. And I think it was, just the rush of all the new species, all the life birds, and seeing the variety, it just made me suddenly get it, right? That, like, oh my goodness, birds are incredibly diverse. They have all these amazing behaviors, and this is what I want to study. And part of that too was that, to study primates, you have to, in the wild, which is what I was interested in, you have to go to where they are. At that time in my life, I was thinking about what it would be like to raise a family, and the idea of having to go off into the wilds for 3-6 months at a time in another continent didn't really jive with some of my goals as for starting a family. And so switching to birds also made practical sense, which I'm a very practical person. But yeah, that trip to Africa really got me going. I remember some of my favorites were lilac-breasted rollers. They were really fun to watch. And mouse birds. I got to see a little group of mouse birds taking a dust bath one afternoon, and just,
they're kind of like a titmouse with a really long tail.
Yes. And just the joy, like the rush of endorphins of getting to watch these animals in their habitat doing their thing really just kind of sealed the deal. And so when I got back to the States, I began thinking about pursuing a PhD in birds. And I was also interested in doing something more applied where we were trying to solve problems for birds in their habitat. And so that's what brought me back to Arkansas to get my PhD at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville.
Right. And habitat loss is one big problem for birds. You were studying that for your PhD.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned, you were in an animal communications lab before, acoustic communications, right?
Yes.
And carried that now into your current research.
Yeah. So
Communications and
it's been interesting that like, you know, you meander in life sometimes, and you know, your parents might ask you when you're going to get a real job occasionally, and you wonder what it's all for, but then sometimes it all just crystallizes. So when I was getting ready to apply for teaching positions, I was really interested in the aspect of undergrad teaching, which is why I ended up at a place like Hendrix. I started seeing this, you know, it's like one of those moments where you start seeing things like kind of crossover. And I saw the work I'd done in Haven Wiley's lab with bioacoustics and the more applied questions I was asking in my PhD come together in this issue of man-made noise, or what's also known as anthropogenic noise. And I saw an opportunity to use the skills I developed as a master's student and my background in birds and disturbance to understand how new novel acoustic environments like, you know, traffic noise or industrial noise can be influencing the way that birds communicate. And so it all came together, and that's kind of where I'm at right now with some of my research.
so what are some of the things that you and your students have found? How is noise pollution affecting birds and other wildlife?
Yeah, so we've done a variety of things. You know, my focus is birds primarily, but I'm also a bit of a generalist. When I was in college, I had such a hard time choosing a path because I was like, oh my God, I love botany. Oh no, now I love physiology. I was just one of those students that loved every class that I took. And it was hard for me to choose a path, although I did land on primatology, but then obviously switched later. But teaching in a place like Hendrix actually encourages you to be broader in your focus. And through the noise research I've been doing with students, I've been able to study bees. We've looked at fish. We've looked at waterfowl, and also passerines, or so songbirds living in the forests in north central Arkansas. The primary man-made noise stimuli we've been studying, the one that started us off was looking at the noise associated with fracking. So that's, you know, a style of extracting natural gas from the shale geology, essentially, that is underneath our feet. And that's been going on a lot in north central Arkansas. And so I was really interested in looking at how the noise associated with gas compressor stations, which are these really loud, I mean, think of what a generator sounds like, right? When your power goes out, you might have a generator you run. Imagine that times 10 in terms of size, and then times 6 in terms of number, and you get this really incredibly loud stimulus on the landscape that's completely new to these birds. It's right up next to these forests and these fields where they sing in order to attract mates, in order to communicate danger, in order to stick around with their groups. And there's this opportunity for conflict, right? Where the birds are not able to hear each other. They're not able to hear the sound of predators in the environment. It can cause physiological stress. There's a lot of research out there that shows that there are myriad impacts on the well-being, the lives, the survival, the mating success of these organisms. And so we looked in north central Arkansas in the Fayetteville Shale at different areas that had noise that was pervasive on the landscape and areas that had less noise, so were more quiet. And we looked at a suite of birds. There were 6 that we ended up analyzing closely, and we found that some of the birds seemed to sing faster in those noisy environments. Some sang at a higher pitch, so a higher frequency, and some didn't seem to care at all. And it seemed to be related to both the structure of the song as well as the habitat that they live in. And so the animals that seemed to be changing their tune, one of them was a Carolina wren, this little guy right here. I'll show you a picture. Some of you are probably familiar with them. They like to live in your backyards. They're very sassy birds, very adorable little fluff balls. In fact, I would call it a burb with a B, as popular now to call really cute birds. And so lately we've been looking at whether or not these birds, they sing at a higher pitch. So the minimum frequency at which they sing is a little higher in noisy environments compared to quieter environments.
Which travels a lot further,
right,
with background noise.
Right, and so the compressor noise that we're talking about is really low frequency noise, and the idea is that they're raising the pitch because it helps them get around that masking effect.
Yeah.
And so we're testing whether or not that's true, that singing higher actually helps them get around a masking effect. And so these last couple summers I've been out with students and we've been playing compressor noise at them. We've been playing songs that are normal, songs with elevated pitch, and seeing if the birds respond similarly. I was actually just in a meeting before this with one of my students who's currently analyzing the data for that. And it looks like we're finding that Carolina wrens are pretty robust to that. Like they seem to respond normally, regardless of noise, regardless of the type of song we're playing. And I think if any of you have met a Carolina wren, you probably understand why. I mean, these birds are just really, they can be really aggressive. They're really good at adapting to living alongside humans. And so it's not that surprising that they seem to be faring, at least in terms of their territorial responses, similarly in these noisy and quiet environments. Now, this is just preliminary stats that are coming out right now. We have to do a little more looking for that, but this may not be true for other bird species, which we didn't put through these behavioral tests. So definitely more work to be done there.
Well, you got to start somewhere. And when people call me and talk about a mockingbird or a starling that's keeping them up at night or waking them up in the morning, I like to remind them just how much noise we humans make day in, day out, all day long.
Absolutely.
To put up with.
Yeah,
so, I agree. The singing mockingbird for a few weeks is not as bad.
It's the least we could do, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So you said you are adaptable and studying a range of species. Yeah, you also started looking at butterflies, which I love, like looking at butterflies too. How did you get started in that? And what species are you looking at?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I'm a bit of a generalist. Sometimes I don't even call myself an ornithologist because I really kind of see myself as more of an animal ecologist. And so a few years ago, a colleague of mine, I've mentioned him before, he's the one I went to Africa with, Matt Moran, and I were interested in looking at some Arkansas-based conservation issues. And there's this really wonderful program. It's called the Arkansas Wildlife Action Plan. And it's this plan that a lot of different wonderful minds from the state came together to put out a system for essentially prioritizing wildlife that we're concerned about in the state, and then having a competitive grant process where you can put in these grants called state wildlife grants and earn money to conduct your studies or maybe do some habitat restoration. And so one of the species on this list was something called the Texas frosted elfin. And we paired up with a professor from UALR, Bill Baltosser, and Melissa Lombardi from the Fish and Wildlife Service here in Conway, and put together a proposal to study this butterfly, which is potentially going to be listed for under the Endangered Species Act. And so this butterfly occurs from basically northeast the United States all the way down through, we've got a disjunct population in Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas, and that's called the Texas frosted elfin. It's a subspecies. We just don't know a lot about it. There's still so much work to be done on these species that the effort and the money just hasn't been put into really figuring out where they are, what kind of habitat they're using, what sort of things are disturbing their normal lives. And so we became part of the Arkansas team that went out and did that. So we've been looking at this, some would say a terribly drab butterfly. Honestly, it's kind of brownish. It's not like a big, beautiful swallowtail or monarch. And I have to admit, the first time I saw the Texas frosted elfin, I was like, this is the butterfly we're studying? It's like, it's just a little brown butterfly. But I have grown to love these butterflies. I do think they're beautiful now. You look at them up close and they've got these little details, this little frosting on their
Oh
wings.
yeah.
It's beautiful, but I love them for their behavior. So a lot of butterflies will, they're kind of hard to catch. They're very good at flying. They can get away and miss your net. But Texas frosted elfins have this kind of lazy thing about them. They live on this plant called Baptisia, and or that's their host plant. That's where they lay their eggs. And so that's where you often find them. And you can walk up to one and kind of tap the plant to see if it'll raise up. And it comes up and it kind of looks around and is like, well, okay, I'm just going to go back to doing what I was doing. So they're kind of like terrible flyers, and they always go back to their same Baptisia plant, which has been really great to allow us to study it. And we've been finding really good things. In Arkansas, at least, we found that these butterflies are much more widespread than we thought. We've discovered many more populations than we knew about before. And a lot of this work has been done, I have to say, give props to my undergrads who have done a lot of the driving for this and detecting of populations, and my colleague Matt, of course. And so we've actually been finding some really promising things, that maybe this butterfly, at least in Arkansas, is not as threatened as we thought it was. It doesn't mean we don't need to take care with its habitat, and making sure that there's plenty of its host species, wild indigo, for it. But I am very pleased with the results that we found so far, and at least in Arkansas, it seems to be doing a little better than we thought it was.
Oh, that's some good news.
Yeah.
So again, a reminder to everybody, if you have questions for Maureen, you can put them in the chat box or in the comment box, and I'll relay them for you. Hendrix doesn't have a grad student program, it's all undergraduates, but you are really a big believer of undergraduates conducting research, field work, that kind of thing. What advice would you give for young people who want to get started in a career path in ornithology or conservation biology in general?
Sure. Well, so if you're interested in ornithology, I think the best thing you can do, and this is something you don't have to be in college to do, is to start learning your birds, not just by sight, but also by sound. When I was a graduate student at U of A looking for field technicians, I would hire undergrads, and the number one thing was always, can you identify birds? That was so important to the surveys that we were doing. And so those are skills that you can develop on your own, or using online resources, birding with maybe someone who's got some experience that can help show you the ropes. So that's something anyone could start doing. If you want, particularly to go into research in ornithology or conservation, getting a degree in biology or environmental sciences or studies is really useful there. But while you're doing that, really taking advantage of research opportunities. I have found that students who get started early in research opportunities, which any department worth its salt should be offering something, some way to connect students to research. Those students who start early and get involved with a variety of projects, not only do they have, lines for their resume, which of course is important, but more importantly, they know they have these firsthand experiences that help inform them what direction they want to go, right? So I've had students who were dead set on med school. That's what they were going to do because, a lot of people come to college thinking they're going to be doctors. But as they started getting involved with the research, they started seeing that you can make a living playing in the woods. And that was something when I made that realization that I could make a living hanging out in the woods, having that be a big component of my job, like the light bulbs started going off, and I was like, okay, yeah, obviously this, because I actually thought I was going to be a veterinarian for a while. But then taking ecology classes made me realize, so getting exposure to the fields of science that you might want to pursue is really important, and getting that research exposure, because a lot of times associated with research, at least in our department, we really prioritize taking students to scientific meetings where then you get to see what everyone else is doing and you get to start networking with people. And I took 2 students, for example, up to Alaska last summer for the American Ornithological Society meeting. And those students, they knew how to work a room. By the end of it, they had more friends than I had in terms of grad students. And they talked to some like big wigs in the fields that I haven't even had conversations with. And, these are all opportunities for them to then begin pursuing maybe post-Hendricks careers and inroads to grad school. So really exploring, I think, making sure that you leave yourself open to the path that can be, and not getting your eyes not having too much tunnel vision, I should say. You know, I was really nervous to take steps into ecology because that path was a little less unknown to me compared to vet school, which has very prescriptive things you do each year to go to veterinary school. And so deciding to be an ecologist was a little frightening, and I did meander quite a bit, but all of that is coming back to really serve me well in teaching students at a school where we have to wear a lot of hats and sort of how to have a broader exposure to things.
So a question from the audience is, what are some of your future research questions you'll be working on?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I have been working on a couple of projects, launching a couple of projects for this summer. Perhaps some of you have heard about a program called MAPS. It stands for Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survival. And it's a program, a bird banding program that's organized by the Institute for Bird Populations. And what this program does is every summer, there's a set period where people come in and they set up nets and they capture birds and they put individual identifying bands on their legs, and then they release the birds to go on and live their birdie lives. And what happens is these birds eventually get caught again by someone else if these birds move to a different area. And we are able to collect data on the birds in hand when we're banding them, and then someone else can collect data on them when they get recaptured. And what these data do is it helps us kind of understand how bird populations are doing, what their survival rates are like, the types of habitats they're using at your banding station. And so COVID willing, I'm launching this station this summer at an area called Stone Prairie Wildlife Management Area, which is owned and operated by Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. So that's starting up, and hopefully that'll be a really long-running, my dream is for that to become a long-running banding station where I actually get to have people come out and help occasionally, bring in the public, kind of show them what bird banding is about. Because if any of you in this room right now that are watching have ever held a bird in your hand, it's kind of like holding a unicorn. At least it feels like that for me. It's just such a special experience to get up close with the birds and to be able to hopefully be contributing to these databases that will help us understand bird populations better and improve their habitat and whatever we can for them. And so MAPS is something that's on the horizon for me. I'm also teaming up with Game and Fish to run a project in Little Rock. So it's actually an urban ecology project where we're going to be putting out wildlife cameras to hopefully capture some selfies, essentially, of urban mammals that are hanging out in the Little Rock region. So this is also part of a broader data collection effort called the Urban Wildlife Information Network. It originated in Chicago, and cities all over North America are setting up these transects, or these lines of cameras that are moving from a really urban center to a more rural exterior, right? And so what we're trying to see is how urban wildlife, particularly mammals, at the beginning, we might add a bird component later, seeing how they're using the space, whether they tend to be more populous in bigger green spaces, are they using the smaller green spaces? And so the idea here is just to get a feel for what the mammalian community is like in Little Rock, and to understand how they're using the space better, and also hopefully to introduce the citizens of Little Rock and North Little Rock to some of their furry neighbors, and show them that we are actually cohabitating, and there's some really cool stuff going on, even in these urban environments, which can still be part of the biodiversity crisis solution, right? We were talking about native plants before we jumped on, and you know, we have islands of habitat in these urban settings, and I think this camera project is going to show us that urban wildlife is using parts of Little Rock more than maybe we thought.
Well, Audubon, Arkansas has done some camera trapping in Fush Bottoms, I can share that data.
Oh, I'd be interested to see, yeah, and hear about your setup and how and we have to work according to a very particular protocol so
Sure,
that the
sure,
data can be part of this larger national data set. But yeah, let's talk about that sometime.
sure.
Perhaps over beers at Flyway Brewery.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good. I long for that day again.
Yeah.
Uh, Another question for you is, what types of classes would you recommend for adults that are interested in auditing and continuing their education in wildlife and ecology?
Well, I guess so. The answer to that might depend on whether you're near a university where you can take classes. I know that when I was a student at the University of Arkansas, our ornithology class, which was taught by the late, great Doug James, a lot of times we had senior citizens come in. I know there's a special deal in terms of tuition where if you're beyond a certain age, you can come and join these classes. And so our classes were often half non-traditional students that were sort of doing continuing education. So I would recommend opportunities like that if they exist in your area. There's also a lot of great resources online. I often, when I'm getting students started on figuring out how to ID birds, which is a really intimidating task when you're coming at it from, you know, the entry level floor, the Cornell's website has some really fantastic videos for the basics of birding, where they talk, you know, one focuses on shape, one focuses on pattern. There's also behavior and habitat. And so some of these little short videos that sort of ease you into, okay, what are all the variables I keep in mind when I'm beginning to think about birds can be really helpful there. There's also, I'm not sure if we're doing this anymore, but do you remember, Dan, the classes that we used to do through Audubon, through Arkansas Audubon Society? We had some continuing ed classes
Oh,
there. I'm not sure if those are active anymore. I think we took
no,
a
we
pause on
stopped
that.
doing the adult ecology camps.
Right. Well, I will say Master Naturalists is also a really great avenue for that. So if you haven't heard about Master Naturalists, you can Google Arkansas Master Naturalists. And I'm assuming there's programs similar to this in other states where there's actually seminars that happen regularly throughout the year. And they're usually like 3-hour, maybe even sometimes 6-hour long workshop days where they'll bring in, I don't know if you've ever done one of these, Dan, but I know, for example, Dustin Lynch, who's an ecologist for Arkansas Natural Heritage, he'll come in and talk about fish for a morning, and you'll get to learn about the fish of Arkansas, you know, about their ecology. And then the great part about Arkansas Master Naturalists is there's also a service component involved. And so in order to be a certified master naturalist, you have to keep up both your continuing education and your volunteer hours. And it's a great way to meet other people who are like-minded, to give back. We've gone out and done some, for example, invasive species removal at their Arkansas Natural Heritage's natural areas, along with master naturalists. And that's been really neat to see my students come together, you know, this sort of up and coming generation with a generation that has seen a lot of different things, and they all have very similar interests and are learning alongside one another. And that's been really, really rewarding to watch happen.
Yeah, I do teach birding basics to Central Arkansas Master Naturalists every year, and
Cool.
Master Naturalists are an amazing source of volunteer help for Audubon, Arkansas. So thank you all the Master Naturalists out there.
Yeah.
So before I let you go, one last important, what's your favorite bird and why?
I was hoping we wouldn't get to this question. This is a hard one. You know, I know I need to finally figure out what my answer to this question is going to be, but if you were to ask my children, they would tell you that it's a kingfisher. I've got pictures of kingfishers in the house. There's something about them that I just really enjoy. You know, they seem to be unique, at least in the Arkansas landscape. I haven't seen a ton of other species of kingfishers, but they just are always kind of doing their own thing. They have a really interesting call, and the belted kingfisher has this crazy, I always call it a crazy mohawk. They always just kind of look like they have messy bedhead or something like that. So I really enjoy seeing a kingfisher. But, you know, I have to give it back to the wrens. So I never really had a big thing for Carolina wrens until I started studying them. And I've gotten to know them quite intimately at this point. I've been working on them for several years now, along with a colleague of mine, Lisa Marshall. And I just don't think you're going to meet as charismatic as a bird. They are so tiny, but yet so loud and incredibly sassy. They're the birds, like you walk by a brush pile and you hear this like chattering at you. Those are the wrens telling you to get the heck away. They are not afraid to tell humans what's the what. And getting to study these, I feel like this special bond because I get to know these pairs. We go against scientific convention and we started giving them names. This year's theme, it was a prince and princess theme. We've got Prince Philip and Aurora living in a house on one of our properties where we're working. And it's been really great. And I feel it's a privilege to get to know them so intimately and sort of their ins and outs and the ways they vocalize and why they vocalize, what those things mean. I feel like I'm beginning to learn to speak their language a little bit. It's kind of cool.
Cheeseburger, cheeseburger, cheeseburger.
Oh, and Dan, it's so much more than that. I mean, if you take a summer's worth of recordings of Carolina wrens and try to catalog them into different types of calls, I mean, I don't think we still successfully did it. They've got like 40 different vocalizations. Some of them do. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, in my yard, they're all saying, Jimmy, 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 Jimmy.
Yep. We call that the Chewy call. We all have different ways we call it. And my students have actually been really great. There's one that goes, black eyed peas, black eyed peas, black eyed peas. And I didn't come up with that. My student came up with it. And as soon as she put it together, I was like, yes, that is what it's saying. And so now I always know what to call that vocalization.
Great. Well, Maureen, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for your time today, and good luck with your research this summer. I hope things get back on track and go according to plan.
Me too. I really appreciate the time, and for everyone attending, thanks for being here. And I hope that everyone is getting to slow down and observe the birds a little more this spring, and getting to learn a little bit more about them.
I've been enjoying my backyard birds for sure while working from home.
Yeah, same.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Good birding to you all.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.